Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank Buddha for inviting me. You asked me to talk about a particular subject, and actually I've, in the end, just abandoned all of that. I nearly got there, but not quite. Where is our last speaker? That's our last speaker. Oh, here's our last speaker. You were talking really about ancient history, really ancient history. So my ancient history is like 200 years ago, 250, which is, I mean, on a logarithmic scale, even on a logarithmic scale, it's much less. but on a historical scale, it is certainly on the kind of scale that we are all used to. It's quite a long time. And just to give you an idea, there is me in a historical period. And actually, when I was in Cambridge as a student, and okay, so I am the light relief at the end of what has been, I think, an extraordinarily interesting program, of which I have only seen a microscopic part, but even that microscopic part was extremely interesting. So roughly speaking, just in case you sort of fall asleep, I'm going to start with some philosophical and humorous remarks to get going. I'm going to do some key ideas that link physics and biology. During the important development period of the 17th and 19th century, I have chosen some interesting papers from the 20th century, some of which have something to do with statistical mechanics. And then there are some relationships, some discussion of the relationships. There are no equations, I'm sorry, because I loved your equations and I would have liked to put some in. And of course, this is the first time I've given the talk. So, you may feel that you want to argue with almost everything that I've put in there. Okay, so I thought I would start with a paper from PNAS. Heavy use of equations impedes communication among biologists. Rage some people from the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Bristol. They've been exiled. I should tell you, I looked them up. They've been exiled to Exeter. So so maybe you can check them out. The density of equations in an article has a significant negative impact on citation rates, with papers receiving 28% fewer citations overall for each additional equation per page in the main text. They've obviously done a statistical course, these biologists. Long equation-dense papers tend to be more frequently cited by other theoretical papers, but this increase is outweighed by a sharp drop in citations, blah, blah, blah. You remember what they said about Mrs. Thatcher, who knew the cost of everything and the value of nothing? Anyway, it turned out that they were set up. Actually, it turned out that this wasn't spontaneous. You might think these are biologists, they can't do maths. They can't do maths. And then, right, they see all these math papers in biology and they say, what? Hun? They are? You know them? You mean then? Really? Really? You mean they're not stupid after all? Wow. I mean, I hope. Professor Fawcett, Professor Higginson, I hope you are not watching. Okay. Anyway, but it turns out they were set up. They were set up by Robert May. This paper isn't a spontaneously submitted paper to PNAS. It was invited by Robert May, whom I think everybody would agree is no mean mathematician, right? And a man who was known to speak his mind, right? Speak his mind. The model about fucking has to be fucking right, is what I believe he was quoted as saying when discussing the progress of AIDS through Africa through lorry drivers and prostitutes, and how the UN had misspent millions of pounds on a model that he could solve on the back of an envelope. Okay, so do they say the exception proves the rule, or whatever. Here is a very mathematical paper. I'm going to come back to this paper later. The chemical basis of morphogenesis. Look at all these equations. Look at the equations. Look, I think we love those equations. Look, a couple differential equations, functions, blah, 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 Fourier transform, cited by 16,399. Well, of course, you could say it was Turing. You could say people felt obliged to cite it, but it did take Turing some time to be rehabilitated, shall we say. So certainly it's not always true. And I'm going to come back to this question at the end. Okay. So my next question is how to do history, right? I'm an amateur. I should say I am an amateur historian. I love history. At school, my history was better than my mathematics, but it took much longer because if you were interested in history, you had to read and read and read and read, and still it wasn't enough. And in mathematics, you'd sit there scratching your bottom, and this teacher would be going on and on and on, and you'd think, all right, I get it, leave me alone. And then they'd give you a hard time because you weren't paying attention. Okay, so the talk takes the provisional view. There's been progress in history. We've actually understand some things that we didn't understand before. And in the context of history, this kind of view that says we are going upwards is something that's quite common. British historians probably 100 years ago, not so much now, would take the view that the civilizing influence of the British Empire, and I can see here lots of people who have been subject to that civilizing influence, and they've been so subject to the civilizing influence that they decided to come here and be civilizers themselves. Okay, it's been used by Christians and jihadists when describing the progress of conversion to their favorite sect. It's actually used by Zionists as well, if you've ever been to the relevant museum in Tel Aviv. Right, okay. And review articles in science often take this view. They sort of ignore all the byways and wrong turnings and all of that kind of thing. So what real historians of science do is that they discuss all of these wrong turnings and why they made sense. And if they do this, they are called internalists, right? They are looking at the narrative within the science. And of course, we are subject here to the narrative within the science. But Jose here, for example, with all these grants that come from these disgusting pharma companies, is also subject to external influences. And of course, we love those external influences, don't we? We think, but actually, of course, those external influences, the push from society to do learn various kinds of knowledge are important. And so those are the externalists. And the other thing is, we are all interested to some extent or other in history of science, particularly when one grows old and stupid and the brain just works a little bit more slowly, as mine does, but there's not much evidence that knowing too much about the history or being interested in the history of science actually helps you to do it better. And we have all been at parties with philosophers of science who have never written a proper science paper in their lives, who will tell us how to do it. You're from Oxford, right? There's thousands of them sort of crawling into senior common rooms out of holes in senior common rooms and onto dining tables and all that kind of stuff. And they know how to do science. They just never did it because they were so busy telling other people how to do it instead. Okay, so I just thought I'd start with a real problem. And here are some livers. I think they're human livers. And I've downloaded them from the web. I didn't draw them myself. In old times, if you were a distinguished scientist, let's say Robert Hooke, who was looking through his microscope at a beetle or a bug through it, right? He had to be a really great drawer. And my art, I came bottom in art. Well, bottom but one. There was a guy who was forced to draw with his right hand, but he was left-handed. I did better than him. Anyway, but these are photographs And I can ask, what is the purpose of the liver? Does the liver have a purpose? Does it? Well, of course, if you believe in primitive, well, what I might call primitive, old-fashioned sort of religious type of ideas about the creation of life, then you might say, well, you know, humans have been made and all of this kind of stuff has been put in there with a purpose. And teleology is the doctrine that there is a purpose, but sometimes we are really asking the question, what is the function? Because in English, the questions why and what is the function of are sort of similar types of questions. By the way, Buddha, if I start to go on too long, tell me and I'll stop. So you're right, so we want to ask, what's the function of the liver in the organism, or how does the liver work? And we can ask all sorts of questions, right? But I'm just going to ask this one, but just to show that there are various different kinds of questions that we can ask. And here are all sorts of questions that we can ask about the liver, some of which have something to do with the organism. Look, what can on the right, whoops, this machine, isn't it? And it probably shines. Is there a technologist in the house? Yes, I don't want to shine it in your eyes.
That's the thing. Maybe this one.
Oh, okay.
So this button, this little one.
Okay, that's good. Okay. Actually, you know what? I prefer the old-fashioned one. Here we are. So, except that I'm right-handed. But anyway, never mind. What can chemical engineers work about waste treatment from the liver properties? In other words, those are the kind of biomimetic questions. You know, evolution's had ages to answer questions. And over here, you know, we can ask comparative biology questions. Are there comparable organs in vertebrates? And if so, you know, do they come from the same genes or do they come from different genes? How are the genes turned on? What does it develop in the fetus? A whole set of developmental biologist questions. Here's a population biology questions. Human diets change, let's say, because they go from the forest onto the savanna and they've got different food. And so the evolution is being driven by one factor, but obviously that means that we have different food to digest. And so, you know, how long does it take the liver to adapt to? So 1,000 different questions that you can ask about these things, right? And some of these answers involve mathematics and physics, and probably more of them as we go along. Mainly, I'll be talking about the biology of the organism and develop the ideas that are involved with the biology of the organism. Okay. So I'm going to start with reflections on the nature of matter. Right. In ancient times, if you read something like Aristotle, where's our Latin scholar? Latin scholar? Ancient Greek scholar? Nobody there. Okay. If you read Aristotle or something, yeah, hello, Wilson. Yeah, in Greek. Yay. Okay. Huh? Okay, so there are sort of three separate spheres of existence. The heavens, inorganic matter on Earth, and then live matter. Well, of course, you can reasonably say what is alive, and the usual answer to what is alive is, well, I recognize it. A bit difficult to define exactly, but still I recognize it in the same way that I recognize beauty. But anyway, and each obeys a separate set of rules. And here is a sort of cartoon about the life force in traditional narrative. The Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Judah Lev ben Yehuda Lev ben Betzalel, he constructed an image. Here is the image that he constructed out of clay and mud. He breathed onto it, and lo and behold, it was alive. Actually, we like Maharal of Prague because he was an ancestor of mine, but, you know, not necessarily relevant, of course, but I wish I could reach these high, of course, he was interested in different things. But anyway, here's Carlo Collodi. I'm I would guess most people have come across Pinocchio, and he was constructed by his father, Geppetto, from wood, and eventually a fairy transforms him into a real boy. But in both cases, there's some idea of a life force. You know, it's inorganic. If only, right, my machine is inorganic, I'm going to wind it up, I'm going to do something to it, and I'm going to turn it into something alive. And when I've turned it into something alive, it obeys different rules. At least that is, of course, the Maharal was getting his truths from other sources than nature, and Carlo was interested in selling his books, I guess. But okay. So here is Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, from the very Isaac Newton whom we celebrate here. And I have to say, with this long hair and the rather kind of severe look, he really looks very modern, don't you think? He looks very modern. He's the kind of guy that you might meet at a pop festival. He might have been some kind of pop star, the kind that groupies would go after. And it's a terrible shame that, as far as we are aware, he was extremely celibate through the whole of his life. Okay, so he unified the laws of the heaven and the earth, but unifying living and non-living was a bit bigger challenge. The philosophy that said that animate and inanimate entities were entirely different was called vitalism, right? And so the idea somehow was that animate objects, they contain some non-physical element, that they were governed perhaps by different principles. Here's a guy from the 18th century who was talking about the vis essentialis, or sometimes they called it vis vitalis. That was because Latin was the old English, or English is the new Latin, and these guys were writing in Latin. And Wilson is our translator of Latin for us. But only Greek. Oh, okay. All right. Well, okay. So the New Testament was in Greek.
Disappoint me.
Not even Wilson has time. Okay. So these are not things that I can give details about because I didn't study it carefully enough, but experiments were developed to test the idea that life was not governed by mechanistic laws, and the question about vitalism was a vital question in 19th century biology and 18th and 19th century biology, right? Okay, so if we are going to unify physics and biology, the laws of, all right, we first of all have to get some key ideas from physics. We have to know what are the laws that in some sense we want biology to obey. And here are some things that we were gradually discovered in the course of studying physics between the 17th and 19th century: conservation of matter, conservation of energy. The second law of thermodynamics came in the mid-19th century. Entropy was originally discovered in the context of the second law of thermodynamics. And of course, this was all those studies were driven by the study of steam engines, right? Steam engines would make things go, and somehow or other you were able to, you had to put some power in, but you got some power out. Maybe if we were really clever, we could get a machine that went by itself, right? I mean, because somehow or other, they seem to be very powerful. That was, what they call it, yes, right, exactly, perpetuum mobile, right. And so there are these ideas of entropy, and the point really was that once you had got a microscopic idea about what entropy was, right? To begin with, entropy just came from thermodynamics. It was an equation of state. It was a function of state. You simply had no idea what it was, and the reason they had to develop entropy was that it turned out that the caloric theory of heat was wrong. There wasn't a fixed amount of heat that would flow. It was a sensible, sensible first idea, but it turned out not to be right. But entropy was something that you could define, that entropy increased, and now we had a rather more formal way of deciding what a living organism, because living organisms seemed to disobey the second law, right? And as they disobeyed the second law, we all understand vitalism must be correct, right? And the reason that all of this is right, that all of this is important, is that we need an idea of what's meant by a mechanistic law in order to make any progress, right? Here is the conservation of mass. I've got some pictures of Lavoisier. Everybody's heard of Lavoisier. Lavoisier is known for his work in chemistry, for extensive physiological studies. Actually, he collaborated with Laplace. Laplace, you remember whom when Napoleon asked him Laplace had a theory about planets and stuff, and Napoleon asked him, where did God come into all of this? Laplace answered very snottily, I have no need of that hypothesis. Okay. It's also known for the discovery of oxygen, the disproof of the phlogiston theory. You had to weigh stuff very carefully. And unfortunately, because he was a tax inspector, they chopped off his head. Here he is on the way to having his head chopped off. And he showed that mass was conserved in chemical reactions, right? And he gave reasonably, and in work with Laplace, they gave a reasonable idea that that might be the case in respiration, but that respiration consisted of a chemical reaction inside the body, right? So the reason that it was hard was, of course, these experiments with, you had to localize everything and so on. The guy who came up with the idea of conservation of mass is this guy, whose name I cannot pronounce, but we have a native speaker of Russian. There he is. Please pronounce this guy's name. Lomonosov. We like it. Okay. Right. And actually, of course, philosophically, these ideas, the ideas of conservation are much older, right? Nothing comes from nothing. Oh, we have some Greek for Wilson. Okay, okay. But Anaxagoras as well. They were not quite sure what it was that they were conserving, but somehow or other, you sort of were aware that things didn't entirely disappear when you chop them up, and in order to make something, a table didn't materialize out of nothing. But of course, in magic, it does, right? So here's a picture of Aristotle. Well, I mean, the one picture there is of Aristotle, actually, because it's a sculpture. Okay, so, right, so it's a philosophical idea, first of all, and the reason that the experimental proof was took a long time was that all of these chemical reactions involve loss of matter to the atmosphere. And if you don't take very careful account of all of this, then it appears that things are growing. You see a plant growing and you think it comes from nothing, for example, and it wasn't realized that matter had been lost to the atmosphere. And Lavoisier had all sorts of clever experiments and so on and so forth. Okay, right. So the other thing that we are used to having conserved is energy, and Laplace and Lavoisier were reviewing competing caloric and motion theories of heat. Right at that time, there were some people who said that heat is some kind of fluid, that is on. Other people said, no, you're completely wrong. It's just stuff moving around. And eventually Rumford observed heat generated during, well, again, he was being paid by the military, wasn't he? And the term energy comes from Thomas Young, and then the mechanical equivalent of heat comes from, well, Joule was British, and everybody recognized his work more or less immediately. Paul Meyer was unable to convince the German chemical establishment and went mad. As a consequence, he was so upset, and eventually he was rehabilitated. But by the time he was rehabilitated, he had sort of lost 20 years of research and was not able to really get back into research. Okay, so so there's at least an idea that if conservation of energy works in not inanimate inanimate object, then perhaps it will work in animate objects as well. Here is Max Rubner. These guys were working in nutrition and in agriculture and stuff like that. And he used respiration calorimetry. If they do this, roughly speaking, respiration calorimetry is you breathe in some oxygen, you breathe out some carbon dioxide, they figure out how much carbon dioxide, they know what the reaction is, and so they can convert all of this into heat. And so the so-called basal metabolic rate is how much heat or how much energy you are producing just by sitting around. So you have to lie, in the experiment, you just have to lie down and do various kinds of stuff like that. Okay, what's what's happened here? I copied it wrong. I copied with a little hand. Okay. Okay. So what's sort of here's his paper, and I've for Germans in the house might notice the peculiar spelling. There was a spelling tierischen, for example. There was a spelling reform in 1905 that changed the spelling, and the unnecessary H has now been removed from modern German. Anyway, this stuff here I've translated. Despite many individual facts, there's no linking narrative. The fictive life force, which should explain and clarify, was itself in urgent need of explanation and clarification. In other words, right? So here's a piece of propaganda that says that there are all these people that believe in this life force, but it doesn't actually explain anything. It's kind of magic. And here he's used this to show that the breathing, it hasn't quite done the measurements properly, right? The measurements were done by these guys. Look, they're American. Department of Agriculture, Atwater and Benedict, right? And here's their paper, Metabolism of Energy, Matter and Energy in the Human Body. And so that really sort of nailed the problem that said, yes, indeed, in the organism, energy was conserved. Well, that's actually quite important because, you know, the naive view somehow is that our energy, in some sense, energy used in a non-scientific way, it somehow comes from nothing, right? Here's Helmholtz. We've all heard of Helmholtz, and he was preeminent as a physicist, but also as a physiologist. And he was a doctor, and then he turned to physics. He was a great friend of Kelvin's, by the way. He used to come to Scotland year after year and go sailing with Lord Kelvin, right? Anyway, so he used physical principles to investigate organisms and inorganic matter. And there's an enormous, you can find this on the web, an enormous set of collected works, physiological optics, acoustics, both physical and physiological, and they're separated out, incidentally, in the collected works. Cognition, I can't remember, I had to translate this from German, electrodynamics, sound, and energy. I actually just wanted to show you this, not because it's terribly important, but here is, he's on the, I guess, Varma, can't see it. Anyway, something to do with the warmth experiments or phenomena of animals. Oh yes, they've been studied there are two recent works, and one work was by this J. Davy, right? And this J. Davy was actually the brother of the famous Humphrey Davy, and he lived much longer. And okay, I had to mention Lehmann. Lehmann was actually the liquid crystal pioneer, right? And he thought, after he had discovered liquid crystals, which shouldn't be called liquid crystals, but anyway, he thought that after he had discovered liquid crystals, that they were something in between life and not life, right? But he was a hardline materialist, but anti-vitalist, anti-dualist. Dualism is the same kind of thing, the idea that things that go on in the mind and things that go on in the body, as it were, are entirely different. And I just thought I'd show you this sentence, really. This sentence, because this sentence is so long, right? It's so long. And it's actually one of his shorter sentences. That's the thing, right? In this particular case, he's just saying that the magnetic properties of liquid crystals mean that they could be used as a probe to investigate the molecular structure. He's not actually saying here that they are halfway in between, just that the living organisms have got liquid crystal type stuff in them, and therefore they can be used for magnetism. Native German speakers are allowed to. Are you a native German speaker? No, well, but yeah, you know better than me. That's good. That's fine. Is there anyway? Whatever. Okay, you're allowed to interrupt. That's the point. You know, living in Augsburg and stuff like that. Here he's written two books: Liquid Crystals and Theories of Life, and The Apparently Living Crystals. Right, and so he's sort of suggesting that they are related to life. And he attracted, I should say, he attracted a lot of ridicule and generally ribaldry among his colleagues. And I've certainly got letters which say the guy's a lunatic. But of course, when people say that one of their scientific opponents is mad, sometimes they are right. And I think it's been used by one of your Oxford colleagues more recently, who has a government position to describe, what was it? The opposing view on the lockdown, for example. I mean, you in your tea room in mathematical biology probably discuss these things and can tell us more, but preferably after the microscope has been turned on. I understand that it's on air, but we haven't said anything that we shouldn't have said. We just, I think, but you've got technical people that can censor it afterwards. Just in case, because that's what happens on TikTok, isn't it? Here are some pictures that Lehmann had that sort of, he said, aha, they look kind of lifelike. And they look kind of crystalline, so let's call them liquid crystals. Okay, I'm going to just change the subject slightly. I'm going to talk about scaling. What's the time? 20. Okay, I'm going to talk about scaling, right? Because scaling is something that physicists do, applied mathematicians as well, right? They, they have non-dimensional numbers and stuff like that. And here's some power laws. We like power laws, particularly in critical phenomena, which are statistical mechanics. And these ideas, they go back to van der Waals, to Kapitsa, Onsager, Michael Fisher, and so on. But it turns out that these ideas in biology are older still. And I wanted just to talk about it because of the connection somehow between physics and biology. But just to give you an idea why you might want to be doing scaling, here is a microbe living in hydrothermal vents off Iceland. I can't remember where I got this. And it's 4 times 10 to the minus, typical dimension is 4 times 10 to the minus 7 meters, 400 nanometers. Okay, not very big. And here's the giant sequoia. though some of you will have traveled in California and touched the Savoia and been taken, had a photograph taken of you with it, right? I've used 50 meters as a typical size. Of course, they're actually more like 100 meters tall and 17 meters in diameter. But there's a roughly a factor of 10 to the 8 in dimension and 10 to the 24 in mass, and even in physics, that's a big number. So I thought I'd start talking about scaling with Gulliver. Is everybody familiar with Gulliver as in travels? Okay, so here's Gulliver in Lilliput, and you can see all the small people in Lilliput. They've tied him up, which is very, very unpleasant of them, wouldn't you say? And here is a quote from Jonathan Swift. The emperor stipulates to allow me a quantity of meat and drink sufficient for the support of 1,724 Lilliputians. His Majesty's mathematicians, finding my body to exceed theirs in the proportion of 12 to 1, mine must contain at least 1724 of theirs, and thus blah, 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 or equivalently. In our language, the basal metabolic rate is proportional to the mass and proportional to L cubed and the volume and so on. But my view is that His Majesty should also have employed some physicists, because, and the reason, and here's His Majesty not employing physicists, His Majesty, remember, next time, because there had been no diplomatic relations between Lilliput and Florence was where Galileo worked. And here, Galileo's dialogue on the two new sciences had treated the problem. I've also got these pictures on the right-hand side. I think pictures, you know, when you're talking about people, you like to see what they look like. Okay, so Galileo's dialogue on the two new sciences had treated the problem. A similar problem, not of the food required by a larger, otherwise similar animal, but of the mechanical consequences of trying to create one in the first place. Here is a slightly edited version of an early, what does that says? DMDC, that's 1638. Right, so that's why I put that. Okay. Okay, here's a more recent English version. It looks great. And the thing is that Galileo employs the Platonic dialogue method. You know, the ancient Greeks, they didn't write textbook like we did. They had a stupid guy, an intelligent guy, and then another guy asking the kind of chairman or something like that. And they sort of debate and debate. And that's what I did for Greek O-level. And when I was doing Plato for Greek O-level, all those years ago, and that's why I stopped doing it, actually. And so anyway, so in this particular case, Galileo, there's only two of them. There's one called Salviati and one called Simplicio, and Salviati is Galileo, and Simplicio is the man in the pub. And so, of course, there are people who say that he set up his opponents, just though there were also people who said this about Plato, that these opponents, they were made to be stupid, and actually if it had a real proper opponent, they wouldn't have been anything like stupid as that. But anyway, right. Actually, I thought it would be interesting because here is the title in Italian, Discorsi e dimostrazioni matematiche, right? And all that we get, conversations and mathematical proofs concerning two new sciences. But somehow or other, in English, it comes out as dialogues. And I can't help feeling that conversations and mathematical proofs is much more kind of classical. We like that better than just dialogues, you know. Anyway, so here, fun. Asking.
I got a text from Tim Fawcett.
Really? Yeah. Oh, you mean you've told him? Yes. You told him he wasn't watching before. Well, he'll have a chance to watch, won't he? So should I expect a letter from his lawyer? Okay. Okay. So here is Galileo. Well, Salviati pretending to be Galileo, pretending to be right. Nor can nature produce trees of extraordinary size. The branches would break down under their own weight. It would be impossible to build up the bony structures of animals so as to hold together and perform their normal functions if these animals were to be increased enormously in height. Now, my translation, I should say, my translation involves the A's and the B's, because, you have to change to modern style. The modern translations of Euclid, they use modern equations and that kind of stuff. So this is me with A's and B's, but right, you either have to employ a material which is harder and stronger than usual, or enlarge the size of the bones, thus changing their shape until the form and appearance of the animals suggest a monstrosity. And, well, Galileo's artist, I have sketched a bone whose natural length has been increased 3 times. So here's the Lilliputian bone, and here's Galileo's bone. I mean, not quite as much, but it's only 3 times. And look how much broader it is. And of course, we have the same thing. Elephants have these really big legs, and flies, you can hardly see them. They're microscopic. I should say, incidentally, that the way I found this was through Darcy Thompson, who had made some similar comment, and then somebody had pointed this out, and Darcy wrote a letter to Nature to say that that I'm sorry, I completely missed Galileo. I should have known, and so I've modified the transfer. Yeah, okay. So here's an effect, a scaling effect, which Galileo. I mean, of course, these are sort of advanced undergraduate, early postgraduate type of problems, but to try and work this out. But Galileo must have had a really quite powerful intuitive understanding of it. He was paid by the minute. Yeah. I even was doing experiments to. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So it's in another dialogue. It's in another dialogue somewhere. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So all right. So a little bit after Galileo and a little bit after Gulliver, these guys were studying the laws by which the dimensions of a body in certain classes of animals determine the capacity and functional movements of the lung and heart, or equivalently, the metabolic rate. And they said the metabolic rate is proportional, should be proportional to the surface area, which is roughly mass to the 2/3. And at this stage, it was sort of philosophical, not empirical, but anyway. And sort of remember this factor of 10 to the 24. And here is Helmholtz studying a similar problem on a theorem concerning geometrically similar movements of a liquid body, as well as application to the problem of steering balloons. So obviously the balloon zillionaires of the time were funding this work. But the most important thing was that the larger the bird, the faster it had to go. He doesn't cite Cyrus and Rameau, but no evidence that he was familiar. But nevertheless, there's this use of the term geometrically similar. Let me just see how we're getting on. Here's Darcy Thompson. Everybody loves Darcy Thompson. Darcy Thompson, in some sense, has screened work in mathematical biology that occurred before Darcy Thompson. He was not a math. I mean, I think Darcy Thompson would be amazed to know that he was celebrated as a mathematician because he was a biologist with classical training. His father was a professor of classics, but this is an anti-vitalist manifesto. right? And he, roughly speaking, 733 pages or something, seek first the explanation in terms of physical law and introduce vitalistic arguments only if all else fails. And then there's the quasi-religious statement that physical law will not fail, right? And I just thought I would just give you some extracts. This book of mine has little need of preface, for indeed it is all preface from beginning to end. That's the very first, right? So, okay, right. Here he's talking about symmetry breaking, essentially. What happens when cells elongate, right? Here we extend the scope of our inquiry very greatly when we begin to deal with unequal growth, with growth, that is to say, which produces a greater extension along one axis than another. And so that's what we would call symmetry breaking. Again, didn't quite have the mathematics, partly because there wasn't the mathematics, and well, I mean, other people had been studying group theory, chemists and stuff, and mathematicians in the 1880s, so it was there, but right. I thought you might be interested in this one, really, because he's talking about the analysis situs. Analysis situs is what, what's his name? Tell me what, senior moment. It was Poincaré. What Poincaré called what was later called topology, right? And this can be traced back to a fellow called Listing, and the extract foretells the use of topology in the analysis of biological problems. And actually, you can see that the reason he talked about that was that he was seeing that these animals had been in some sense stretched in some directions, and so that they were all the same. And if you applied some kind of mapping to them, then they would all come back to the same guy. And I've really shown these pictures because they are great pictures, and there's hundreds of them. Okay, so okay, not everybody loved Darcy Thompson in the way that we all love him nowadays, right? For example, here's a review from 1918. Professor Thompson's work is recommended as one of the most notable and most readable of scientific books appearing in the past decade. I think Cambridge University Press, right? We like Cambridge University Press. We hope you have visited the Cambridge University Press bookshop, right? Here's an American reviewer. How do you know? How do I know? How do I know? No doubt American readers will be surprised at the omission of significant American literature and the absence of names familiar to every modern student of formed determination. Well, I mean, of course, he could have been from Vietnam, couldn't he? Yes. Right. Okay. Right. Maybe he was Brazilian. That was probably you're right. I agree. Right. The reviewer would go further and point out that some of the chapters of which the volume is a preface have already been at least partially written, but no reference to them is to be found. Well, actually, he was right. Thompson, there were only 500 copies of the original book published, and it took till about 1930 or something to get rid of all 500. So the fact that there were all these pages was a bit of a discouragement. But then the publishers said, "Oh, 500 copies, that's so many. We must have a second edition." And so he started to write a second edition. And the second, as always with people, the second edition is longer, and it's sort of with more and more detail, but somehow that hides the key principles. And then there was a fellow called Bonner who finally said, no, this is too, and who abridged it all in 1952. But I just thought I would make some comments, right? Theodosius Dobzhansky, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. But Thomson, he wasn't really very keen on Darwin. He had written a paper in the 1980s to say, you know, suggesting that Darwin was at the very best incomplete. There are 32 mentions in those 773 pages of evolution and no mention at all of natural selection. And as for genetics, nothing at all. And genetics was really, in 1917, genetics was really, you know, one of the, it was in vogue. But I did find a mention of the genetics at the back of the book. At the back of the book, there are some ads. If you like this book, perhaps you will like all of these other books. And there's a long list, you know. And one of them was Mendel's Principles of Heredity by W. Bateson. Here he is, William Bateson, director of the John Innes Horticultural Institute. The John Innes Horticultural Institute, the one in Norwich, it's still there. It's still there. It's still producing good science. And Mendel was a kind of, no, Bateson could be said to be a kind of Jesus for Mendel's John the Baptist, if I can use a Christian analogy there. Actually, only 38 figures as opposed to the 600 and something in Darcy Thompson. But what, from our point of view, you wanted me to talk about statistical mechanics, but that's unfortunately in the next lecture, which unfortunately has been cancelled. Right. There's no mention of statistical mechanics, no mention of Boltzmann, no mention of Gibbs, who had been discussing entropy. And then somebody told him, you know, these entropy guys, it could be an important idea. There's one sentence in the 1942 edition. So I think really we should just sort of rewrite there should be an ongoing program to rewrite Darcy Thompson in the way that we want. Huh?
One sentence.
I can't remember, honestly, can't remember, but I've got it. Oh, you'll be gone by the time I look it up in. Yeah, okay, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to come back to scaling. So there's this fellow Max Kleiber, and he was another agriculturalist. I have a friend who's a nutritionist, and they are really keen on this kind of stuff. And so he's got a log. So actually, this is great. When I started my career, we did graphs like this. We wrote them out, and then we photocopied them, or we got the art person in the department to take a photograph, and then we glued them into the paper. Log of metabolism against log of body weight, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he derived the 3/4 law. So that the surface law was wrong. After all that trouble, it was wrong. It's not a 3/4 law, it's a 2/3 law. Now he's only got doves and rats. He's changed the sex, 2 different sexes of rats. He's done hens, but we don't have any cocks. We've got 2 different species of dog, 2 different sexes of dog, sheep, women and men, and 2 different versions of, okay. But anyway, the important thing was that up till then, people hadn't quite, you know, they'd seen some departures from this 2/3 law, and they said, aha, that means that the effective physiological surface area was different. And Kleiber says, no, you've got all that the data that we've got gives us a power law, right? This is his power law, right? Now we have to interpret the power law, right? And the other thing that people were teaching was a biological explanation in terms of natural selection, or a physical explanation in terms of the law of mechanics. And Kleiber said, look, guys, both are important, and you can't go with one without the other, as it were. Okay. This whole idea of scaling eventually got called allometry. It's a much posher word, allometry. Here's Sir Julian Huxley, a famous guy. And actually, it's come back into the physics literature by Geoffrey West, who decided that biology was more fun than some kind of abstruse high-energy physics. Right, 5 minutes. Yeah, okay. And here are some other parallels. Let's see. I was going to talk about Volterra, but I won't. here is right, at this point, people started to discuss theoretical biology in some sense separately from experiments. When I went for a job in the Department of Chemistry in Bristol in 1980, they said, very interesting, but can you do second year demonstrations, which of course couldn't do. But now, so even in the 1980s, chemistry was a bit dubious about theoretical chemistry. So they had a club that was thinking about that. Here is systems biology. All right. Waddington is the originator of this term landscape, energy landscapes, and all of that kind of thing. And this idea of systems biology. You know, I think I'm just going to very quickly just go non-equilibrium thermodynamics, something important. Here is Schrödinger, picture of Schrödinger. The important thing is that he proposed that chromosomes were aperiodic solids. Here's some background to people figuring out what chromosomes were, and you will, I'm sure, be aware of all of the interesting news that has come out about Schrödinger in recent years. Here is von Bertalanffy talking about thermodynamic open systems. So 1950, that's the first time that people said, yes, we can do thermodynamic, but they're non-equilibrium systems. We have to think about them as having stuff coming in and stuff coming out. There's Turing again with his reaction diffusion equations. I just want to make really some key points. First of all, he talks about modeling. A mathematical model of the growing embryo will be described. It's a simplification and an idealization and consequently a falsification, right? So we hope that nevertheless it's useful. So that's everything that we say about modeling nowadays when we teach our students, and nevertheless was not entirely clear to everybody, right? No new scientific laws, right? Certain well-known physical laws are sufficient. However, you've got to be very clever. You've got to know mathematics, biology, and chemistry, right? And finally, I got these differential equations. I couldn't solve them. I had to solve them on the computer. And only Turing at that time was able, even if he had got as far, a competitor had got as far as that, they would have been stuck. But only Turing could have said, by chance, right? Just by chance, I have a method for doing this as well, right? And the other interesting thing, 6 references, all very old, including a reference to Darcy Thompson. And if you look to see where he mentions Darcy Thompson, there is no reference to Darcy Thompson. There's just a reference to Darcy, right? No citation, right? So one supposes that he'd read it and stuff like that. I'm gonna just quickly more about open systems. Here is Prigogine catching Nobelitis. He starts off writing a book on the thermodynamics of irreversible processes. We like that. And then he goes on to from being to becoming, order out of chaos, the end of certainty, all sorts of stuff that we might think of as bullshit, or we might think of as profound. Who can say? I couldn't possibly comment. But he was a winner of the Nobel Prize, and so I certainly wouldn't dare comment. Here's Shannon talking about, not interested in biology, but talking about messages and getting messages and introducing entropy. Interestingly, he found this formula. Of course, he had no idea what it was, but luckily von Neumann was in the next office, and von Neumann said, aha, you know what, you've got entropy. He said, okay, I've got entropy, right. Here is a paper, could be important, could not be, but thinking about the statistical physics of self-replication. No idea how important this is in terms of basal metabolic rate or anything, but it is something that in the context of a theory of life, you have to think about. And here are some journals. The Journal of this is right, so in the modern age, the Journal of Theoretical Biology, 1961, interestingly measured in shillings. The price is measured in shillings, not in pounds. papers that are concerned with experimental work will not be accepted, but put your mathematics in the appendix, right? So they are with Fawcett and what was his other name? Anyway, so they're right. And then, right, then, well, blow me down with a figure, right? But Springer comes along with the Journal of Mathematical Biology, and they say the journal welcomes mathematical papers inspired by biological research and papers which blah, blah, blah. So who knows whether, how important mathematics is after all. So I just wanted to speculate, naive speculations. Why has it been so difficult, right? Well, if you just think about the kind of discussions that we have had here, all these things, all these sort of preconditions, all these, right, that you need non-equilibrium statistical mechanics, you need equilibrium statistic mechanics, and not sufficiently, you need them in condensed matter. So all of this, so the mechanics that Darcy Thompson thought was going to be important was insufficient. And here you needed mathematics. You needed considerably more sophisticated mathematics than you would have had 100 years ago. We still don't know whether we've got all the mathematics that we need. I mean, I'm expressing some confidence that this program is doable, right? You need all sorts of experimental techniques, which we don't discuss. We probably need the link between entropy and information. It's no wonder it took hundreds of years to abolish vitalism. And here are my conclusions. And the most important of the conclusions is that we are in the midst of a conceptual revolution. You people, I am a describer, but you people are part of that conceptual revolution, which down the road, unless something awful happens to us from all these horrible people who are trying to kill us at the moment, right, it will allow us to understand life on all sorts of scales, and biology will be quantified like chemistry and physics. And the Nobel Prize winner who said, I did biology because it was science and I didn't have to do maths, will unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how I look, be abolished. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end. That, ladies and gentlemen, is probably the end of the program.
So thank you very much, Tim, for a very entertaining and entertaining talk. Are there any questions or comments at this on this?
Joseph, Tim Fawcett asks, what's the evidence that Bob May tricked them to write the paper?
No, didn't. Well, it says that it says on the paper that it was invited. It says on the right. It does deny it. Right. It sounds to me like that by the time we appear on YouTube, I'm going to have to do some.
Well, we have some serious talk to do. It is streaming live, actually. Yeah. Joseph.
Jose, I want to say to you before you ask the question or before you make the comment, thank you very much for not interrupting me. Like you interrupted, and thank you very much for sitting at the back. I think it was very considerate of you.
Enjoying your perspective, and there's something interesting that came out of it. Actually, I think that when the departments were less divided, right? When people from different departments actually sit together, I think it was more interaction than we had on the 60s and the 70s, when things sort of, physics really sort of separate itself from biology. Then we have a resurrection of it. What's interesting to notice that a lot of the stuff you present here is pre-50, and I think that now we are coming back to this sort of interdisciplinary thing. Before it was because I think everybody was the same place.
But don't you think that the interdisciplinarity, I mean, in some sense, we were ready for that disciplinarity, that if we went back 50 years or something, 100, you know, it was actually quite difficult for physicists to make contact with the biologists without sort of various kind of without various pieces of progress being made. I mean, that would be my speculation. I mean, without
example that people that are interested in the interface of physics and biology, like John Hopfield, that was my advisor, when he moved to Caltech, he said he left Princeton as professor of physics and went to Caltech, and he'll join any department but physics because those people are unable to talk about anything else. So it tells you that a very interesting thing that you're talking about happening in the 90s.
All right. One interesting relevant comment is that I've spent my career in a mathematics department. Although, you know, I think if people were to look at the work that they do, they'd say on the whole, I'm a physicist. But what I've been allowed to do in a mathematics department, which I might not have been allowed to do in the physics department, is to, you know, look at problems in anthropology and write, you know, cod history, if you like. And people say, yes, you got it published, how nice. And I have a feeling that in physics, I would have been under a little bit more pressure to produce things that people recognized as being physics. You know, John Simon in the 80s left Bristol and went to London to do sociology of science, and at least partly because of this feeling that the kind of thing that he did isn't the kind of thing, you know, which was to do with the sociology of science, the nature of ideas, wasn't something that you should do in a physics department.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Okay. I guess all good things come to an end. And so this is going to be the end of the program in some sense. We are still going to be here next week. Some of us are here, but this is probably the last talk of the program. It's been a great program, and it's been very nice because all of you guys came. I can only thank my co-organizers for this, because without their help and active, by that I mean like active matter, like being hands-on and help, this couldn't have been done. So thank you, Tani, and Tomohiro is not here, but and Christoph and Sluckin. And I hope that we're going to meet in 10 years' time if everything goes okay. Thank you.